The first snow of 1881 fell hard across the high plains of the Wyoming Territory. The wind that came with it wasn't just cold, it had teeth, the kind that bit through wool coats and cracked wagon wheels in the night. By December, every settler in the valley had retreated behind thick stone walls or log fortresses stacked high with firewood. Every man, that is, except one. They called him the half-savage. He'd come down from the hills 2 winters before, lean, quiet, and carrying little more than a bundle of hides and a crooked smile. His name was Henry Claymore, though most never bothered to ask. To the townsfolk, he was just the odd drifter who'd set up a circular hut of willow poles and hides out by the creek bend, something they said looked more like an Indian camp than a Christian home. And when the first snow came that year, the laughter followed. "Hope that paper tent's got room for his frostbitten toes," one rancher said at the saloon. "Fella builds a wigwam in Wyoming and calls it home," another added. "He'll freeze stiff before Christmas." But Henry didn't seem to mind. Every morning they'd see him walking the riverbank in his buckskin coat, axe slung across his shoulder, cutting driftwood while the rest of them were hauling wagon loads of logs. He'd hum to himself, slow, thoughtful, and vanish into that low dome of willows by dusk. And when smoke started rising from the top of his lodge, it was thin, lazy, almost modest, nothing like the choking black pillars pouring out of their chimneys all winter long. At first they thought he was half mad, but come January, when the valley froze solid and even the cattle huddled against barn doors, folks started whispering that maybe the drifter's hut wasn't as foolish as it looked, because Henry wasn't shivering. While most homesteaders were burning through cords of oak like tinder, his little Indian lodge seemed to sip firewood like a man savoring whiskey, slow, measured, satisfied. No roaring fires, no constant chopping, no smoke coughing into the night, just that faint, steady column from the hole in the roof and a glow like lantern light under the hides. Still, nobody dared ask how he did it. Pride runs deep in frontier men, and admitting that a stranger, one living like the people they'd spent years displacing, might have known something they didn't, well, that was a hard pill to swallow. But when the second storm rolled in, one that buried fences and froze pumps solid, the laughter stopped. Because that was when Henry Claymore's lodge started drawing attention for real. The wind that week didn't just howl, it screamed. It ripped shingles off roofs, snapped stovepipes, and blew sparks into barns. Families huddled in their kitchens, feeding fire after fire until their wood piles shrank to nothing. Men trudged through waist-deep drifts just to split more before nightfall, and out there by the river bend, Henry's lodge stood half buried in snow, and yet still alive. The smoke rose thin as a thread, and at night the faint amber flicker of firelight pulsed steady, like the heartbeat of some sleeping beast. When the storm finally passed, curiosity won out. John Merrick, a blacksmith from town, hitched up his mule and rode out to see for himself. He'd nearly frozen his own forge shut trying to keep his family warm, and the thought that some drifter might be coasting through the winter with half the effort gnawed at him worse than the cold. He found Henry outside, kneeling by the creek, dipping a pot into a hole he'd kept open in the ice. The man looked up, smiled faintly. "Morning's still good for water," he said. Merrick dismounted, rubbing his hands. "Ain't you froze out here yet?" Henry chuckled. "Not hardly. You'd be surprised how little heat a man needs when he keeps it where it belongs." Merrick squinted at the lodge. It was no taller than his shoulder, a dome of hides stretched over bent poles, the seams plastered with a mix of clay and grass. Smoke drifted from a hole at the top like a chimney, but there were no windows, no gaps, just a low opening covered by a flap of buffalo hide. "Looks like something out of a Sioux camp," Merrick muttered. Henry nodded. "It is. Learned it from a Lakota man years ago. Said their grandfathers built 'em before the snows came. You can keep warm in one of these with nothing but a good fire and your own breath." Merrick frowned. "That's so? Seems awful small for comfort." Henry shrugged. "That's the point. Smaller the space, less you gotta fight the cold. Heat don't escape what it can't find." He said it so matter-of-factly that Merrick didn't know what to say. The blacksmith followed him inside, ducking through the flap, and immediately stopped dead. It was warm, not stifling, not smoky, just steady. The air felt thick, like it held the heat instead of leaking it. A small fire burned at the center, ringed with smooth stones. The hides overhead glowed golden in the firelight, and the ground was layered with woven reeds and furs that trapped warmth underfoot. Merrick crouched, eyes wide. "You built this yourself?" "From what I had," Henry said, adding a stick to the fire. "Took 3 days. Ain't much to look at, but it works." Merrick ran a hand along the inside wall. It was warm to the touch. "You got clay in these seams?" "Clay and grass. Holds tight. breathes just enough. The heat from the fire warms the air between the walls and the hide. Works like a stove, if you know how to tend it. Merrick chuckled in disbelief. You're telling me this here hut burns half the wood my place does? Henry stirred the coals. Less than half some days. I use what I need, not what I think I need. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling through the trees. The sound didn't reach them inside. It was as if the world outside had gone mute, swallowed by the insulation of hide and earth. For a long moment, the blacksmith just sat there, silent, the orange light flickering in his eyes. Damn, he whispered finally. Maybe we've been building wrong all this time. Henry smiled faintly. Not wrong, he said, just forgetful. When Merrick rode back to town that afternoon, he didn't tell anyone what he'd seen. Not yet. Men in that valley had strong opinions about what counted as civilized, and saying a primitive lodge was warmer than their cabins would have made him the next target of their laughter. But word got out anyway. Someone saw the tracks. Another swore they saw Merrick's mule near the creek bend. And by week's end, every man in town was curious enough to think about riding out themselves. Only one did. And he didn't come for curiosity. He came for help. It was old Samuel Price, whose youngest had taken sick from the cold. Their cabin stove couldn't keep up, and his wife had burned through nearly every stick of wood they had left. Desperation has a way of humbling even the proudest man. That night, under a moon so bright it hurt to look at, Samuel knocked on Henry's hide flap with his hat in his hands. What happened after that night spread through the valley like a story told around 100 fires, and none of the men who once called him half savage laughed again after hearing it. The moon was nearly full that night, hanging pale and round above the snowbound valley like a ghostly lantern. The wind had finally gone quiet, but the cold had not lessened. It pressed against the land like a heavy hand. Samuel Price could feel it in his lungs with every breath as he trudged through the drifts toward the faint, pulsing glow that marked Henry Claymore's lodge. Behind him, the river murmured beneath its crust of ice, the only sound in miles. He'd walked nearly 2 miles from his cabin, carrying his boy wrapped in a blanket against his chest. The child was burning with fever. His small frame shook against Samuel's coat, and each ragged breath made Samuel's heart kick faster. He'd never been a man to ask for help, not from a neighbor, and certainly not from a drifter who lived like an Indian. But tonight, pride didn't matter. Tonight, it was about his son. By the time he reached the low mound of hides and clay, his beard was frozen solid, and his fingers were stiff enough that he could barely lift them to knock. He did anyway. 3 sharp raps on the buffalo hide flap. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the flap opened, and a rush of warm, smoky air spilled out. Henry's face appeared in the glow, calm as ever. "Evening," he said softly. "Get in here, Price. You'll freeze out there." Samuel stumbled inside without a word, clutching his boy. The sudden warmth hit him like a wave, dizzying and thick. The fire in the center burned low and steady, just coals and a few glowing sticks. Yet the lodge felt as warm as a summer barn. The smell of smoke and damp earth mingled with something faintly sweet, sage or spruce maybe. Henry pulled a fur across the door behind him, sealing the cold out. "Lay him down," he said. Samuel hesitated. "He's bad off," he muttered, voice cracking. "Fever took hold 2 days ago. My stove's been burning near round the clock, and it's still colder inside than out. Don't know what else to do." Henry crouched beside the boy, pulling back the blanket. The child's face was flushed and slick with sweat. His lips cracked. Henry pressed a hand to his forehead, then nodded. "He'll be all right," he said quietly. "He needs warmth that holds, not heat that fights itself." Samuel blinked at that, unsure what he meant. But Henry was already moving. He spread an extra hide near the fire, laid the boy upon it, and fetched a small clay pot from the side of the hut. Steam rose from it. Pine needles and bark boiled down in water. He dipped a rag, wrung it out, and placed it gently on the boy's chest. "Steam helps the lungs," Henry murmured. "The Lakota use pine when the snow sickness comes, opens the air, draws out the fever." Samuel watched, silent, torn between suspicion and hope. His people didn't take kindly to Indian medicine, but then again, his people's medicine hadn't done much this winter except empty their wood piles and fill the graveyard. Henry sat cross-legged by the fire, stirring the coals with a stick. The glow painted his face gold and amber, his eyes reflecting the same calm as the lodge itself. "You keep your stove burning all day?" he asked. Samuel nodded. "Ain't got much choice. Soon as it dies down, the whole place goes to ice. Feels like trying to heat the prairie." "That's because you are," Henry said. He poked another stick into the coals, and the warmth seemed to deepen rather than flare. "You build big, you lose big. Cabin walls leak heat like a hole in a bucket. The wind steals it faster than fire can make it. But here," he He glanced upward. Here, the heat has nowhere to go. The earth helps hold it. The air moves gentle. The fire breathes just enough. Samuel frowned, trying to picture it. You saying this little dirt hut of yours holds heat better than a log house? I ain't saying it. I'm feeling it, Henry replied simply. For the first time that night, Samuel allowed himself to breathe easy. He sank back against the wall, feeling the strange, even warmth soaking through his clothes. His boots were drying already. The boy's breathing had steadied. The fire barely cracked, yet its heat filled every corner. Outside, the wind began to moan again, but inside the lodge, it was distant, a memory rather than a threat. The sound was softened by the layered hides and clay. Even the light felt different here, soft, gold, gentle. You live out here all winter? Samuel asked finally. Second winter now, Henry said. First year I spent learning what worked and what didn't. Found out you don't need near as much as folks think. I keep maybe half a cord of wood, less sometimes. Burn what I need to cook, a little at night. This lodge keeps the rest. Samuel shook his head in disbelief. We go through 3 cords. Easy, sometimes 4. Henry smiled faintly. Cabins are fine when you got endless wood, but when the hills thin out, men will remember how the old ones built. Samuel leaned closer to the fire, rubbing his hands. And you learned this from the Lakota? Henry nodded. From a man named Wicasa. Spent a winter with his family up north, near the Tongue River. I was half-starved then. Lost my horse, near lost my life. They took me in, built a lodge like this for their winter camp. Warmest I'd ever been. Taught me more about surviving cold than all my years of trapping. Samuel looked around again, slower this time, seeing the craftsmanship behind the simplicity. The poles were curved with purpose, each one fitted into the next like ribs. The clay seams were smooth and tight. The floor was layered with woven reeds, and over that buffalo hides and bear pelts. In one corner sat bundles of bark, herbs, and tools neatly wrapped in cloth. It was no hovel. It was a machine, a living, breathing shelter built from the land itself. Henry poured a bit of broth into a tin cup and handed it to Samuel. Drink that. You look like you've been through the mill. Samuel sipped. It was hot, smoky, and rich. Rabbit and spruce, maybe. He felt it spread warmth from his chest outward. The boy stirred and coughed weakly, but when his eyes fluttered open, the fever seemed to have eased. Samuel let out a long breath. You saved him, he said quietly. Henry shook his head. No, the fire did. I just showed it where to stay. Word of that night spread fast, carried in whispers through the valley. By week's end, the same men who once laughed at Henry's primitive hut were taking quiet trips to the creek bend. Some went under the excuse of curiosity, others under the veil of neighborly concern, but all of them came back changed. A man named Andrew Tucker was the next. He'd lost 2 fingers to frostbite chopping wood for a fire that couldn't keep pace with the wind. He sat inside Henry's lodge for half an hour and came out shaking his head, muttering, "It's like sitting in the belly of a stove." Then came the Harpers, a couple with a newborn. Their chimney had collapsed under ice, and the smoke nearly asphyxiated them. Henry built them a small lodge beside theirs, showed them how to pack the clay, how to vent the smoke through a narrow cone so it drew air properly. They stayed in that Indian lodge the rest of the winter, and when spring came, their baby was the only one in the valley who hadn't taken sick once. It wasn't long before even the proudest of the settlers started watching the river bend with a different kind of gaze. They still didn't quite trust the man who'd built it. Some said he'd gone native, others called him wild, uncivilized. But when February came and their own chimneys sputtered black smoke while his lodge sent up nothing but a thin silver thread, envy began to outweigh suspicion. Henry, for his part, kept to himself. He never charged for advice, never asked for anything. When a man came to him asking about building one, he'd nod, walk them to the edge of the willows, and show them how to bend the first pole. He'd say, "Don't fight the cold, make peace with it, build low, let the wind slide over. Trap the warmth under your breath." Some listened, most went home, tried it halfway, failed, and blamed him for it. But the ones who truly followed his instructions, they didn't forget. By March, the valley began to thaw. The drifts melted, the air softened, and the rivers broke open with the sound of grinding ice. The homesteaders emerged from their cabins, pale and weary, to survey the damage. Half of them had roofs that needed fixing, chimneys that had cracked, or woodpiles whittled to nothing. And then there was Henry's place, untouched. The lodge still stood, snug and round, the hides darkened from weather but strong. Grass already sprouted near its base where the warmth had melted the snow early. Merrick, the blacksmith, rode out again that spring, this time not out of curiosity but respect. He found Henry working by the river, shaping willow poles. "Building another?" Merrick asked. Henry nodded. "For Samuel Price. Man's got a sick wife. Says she can't take another winter in that drafty cabin." Merrick dismounted and helped him stack the poles. "You ever think of teaching folk proper? could make a living of it?" Henry smiled faintly. "I ain't much for making a living. Just staying alive suits me fine." The two men worked side by side in silence, the river running bright beside them. Merrick noticed how Henry's hands moved, slow, deliberate, no wasted effort. The willow poles bent smooth under the pressure, and he tied them with rawhide in a perfect dome. When it was done, Merrick stood back and let out a low whistle. "You know, it ain't pretty, but it's something. Feels solid." Henry wiped his hands. "Ain't meant to be pretty. It's meant to hold warmth, not compliments." Merrick chuckled. "You talk like a preacher for the cold." Henry shrugged. "Maybe I just learned to listen. The land's got a way of speaking. Most folks are just too busy chopping to hear it." By the time autumn came again, the valley looked a little different. Here and there, among the neat log cabins and plank barns, small domes of earth and hide appeared, awkward, unfamiliar, yet oddly natural against the hills. The same men who once mocked the primitive hut now found themselves quietly borrowing from it. Some added clay insulation to their cabin walls. Others built smaller winter huts in the style Henry showed them, just big enough for sleeping and cooking. They burned less wood that year. Half, some said, and though they never said it aloud, they all knew why. Henry didn't boast, didn't take credit. When they came to thank him, he only nodded and said, "You figured it out yourself." But inside he felt something shift, a quiet satisfaction. Not pride, exactly. Just the sense that maybe the line between the civilized and the primitive wasn't as real as folks like to think. Because the truth was simple. Warmth didn't care what kind of roof kept it in, only whether it was welcome there. And as the first frost of the new year came down, the valley no longer laughed at the man by the creek. They watched the thin thread of smoke rise from his lodge, and some of them, for the first time, saw it not as a mark of savagery, but as wisdom. Yet not everyone was content with that quiet change. There was one man in the valley who still spat when Henry's name came up, a man whose pride burned hotter than his stove ever had. His name was Amos Laird, and before the winter was through, he'd test just how much that primitive lodge could endure, and how much Henry Claymore himself could forgive. By the next autumn, the valley had grown quieter in its ways. There was less boasting at the saloon, fewer wagons rattling at dawn, fewer arguments over who'd chopped the largest woodpile. The men who once bragged about their cabin sizes now spoke in low tones about insulation, airflow, clay mixes, and fire efficiency, words they'd barely known a year before. Henry Claymore's ways had settled into the valley like seeds on the wind, but not everyone took kindly to it. Amos Laird never did. He'd come west 2 years earlier, full of swagger and silver talk. He was a big man, proud of his work, and prouder still of his homestead, a grand place built from thick pine logs, the only 2-story cabin in the valley. He'd called it Laird's Rest, carved his name over the lintel in bold letters, and once bragged that it'd still be standing when every hut and hovel around it had rotted into dirt. That winter proved him wrong. The roof had buckled under snow, one of the chimneys cracked from heat, and his wife took sick from smoke inhalation. He'd burned through 4 full cords of wood before January and had to buy more from neighbors. The experience left him raw and bitter. So when folks started whispering that Henry's Indian-style lodge was the smartest house in the valley, Amos took it as a personal insult. He told anyone who'd listen that the man was a fraud, that his lodge was luck, not wisdom, and that anyone living like a savage didn't deserve the respect of decent folk. But the truth was, Amos wasn't angry at Henry. He was angry at himself, at the idea that all his money, his pride, and his so-called progress couldn't buy what a half-wild hermit had found with sticks and hides. And when envy festers long enough, it grows teeth. It was late November when Amos first rode down to the creek bend. Snow lay thin and soft across the ground, whispering beneath his boots as he dismounted. His breath came in great clouds, his gloved hand gripping the rifle slung over his shoulder, more from habit than threat. The lodge stood just as it always had, low, round, smoke curling gentle from the top. Henry was kneeling by the riverbank, repairing a net. He looked up as Amos approached, and though his face betrayed no surprise, his eyes narrowed slightly. "Morning, Mr. Laird," he said. "Haven't seen you out this way before." Amos spat into the snow. "Ain't had reason to, but word's got around you've been telling folks how to build homes. Folks forget I helped half this valley raise their cabins, and now they're out here copying Indian tricks instead." Henry set his net aside and stood. "I don't tell anyone what to build," he said calmly. "They ask, I show 'em, nothing more." "That's the thing," Amos said, stepping closer. "You show 'em wrong. Teaching folk to crawl inside dirt mounds like badgers. You're making us look like fools to anyone riding through." Henry's tone stayed even. "No one's looking, Amos. The land don't care how you build, only whether you respect it." Amos's jaw tightened. "Respect it? I've cut every beam by hand, hauled stone from the ridge, Nailed every plank myself? You think living in a hole's more respectable than that? Henry looked him over. I think maybe you've been fighting this place so hard you forgot you're a guest in it. The words struck like a slap. Amos's face reddened, and for a moment Henry thought he'd swing at him. Instead, the man gave a cold smile. Enjoy your little wigwam, Claymore. We'll see how it holds when a real storm hits. He turned and stomped back to his horse, leaving a line of deep boot prints in the snow. Henry watched him go, then returned to his work, though he couldn't quite shake the feeling that the storm Amos mentioned wasn't the one coming from the sky. The storm came 3 weeks later. It started as a whisper, a slow, drifting snow that painted the land white. Then the wind turned mean. By nightfall, the valley roared like a sea in fury. Trees bent low, fences vanished under drifts, and every cabin creaked under the weight. Henry's lodge stood steady, the hides stretched tight, the clay hard as stone. Inside he sat cross-legged by the fire, reading an old half-torn Bible by the amber light, listening to the howl beyond the walls. The wind slid over the rounded roof like water over rock. No sharp corners to catch it, no seams for it to pry apart. The fire's heat breathed slow and even. He just added a log when a faint sound reached him. A knock, weak and frantic, nearly lost to the storm. Henry rose at once and pulled back the hide flap. A man stood outside, half buried in snow, his beard iced solid, eyes wild. It was Amos Laird. "Help me," he gasped. "Roof caved in. My wife's still inside." Henry didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and a coil of rope, slung an axe over his shoulder, and followed Amos into the storm. The wind was so fierce it felt alive, shoving against them with invisible hands. The snow bit into their faces, turning the world into a blur of white. The only thing visible was the dim shape of Laird's cabin ahead, its roof sagging under a thick mound of snow. Smoke poured out from a crack in the wall, not from a chimney but from somewhere lower. Amos stumbled toward the door, shouting his wife's name. Henry caught his arm. "Wait! Smoke's wrong! You'll choke going in like that!" He dropped to his knees, feeling the wind's direction, then circled to the leeward side. There, beneath the drift, the earth was still warm. He dug with his hands until he found the source. The stove's pipe had split, sending smoke back into the room. Henry kicked open a section of the wall to vent it, coughing as the grey clouds poured out. Then he crawled inside. The air was thick, acrid. He could barely see. The stove lay on its side, glowing faintly, and a woman was slumped near the bed. He dragged her out through the hole, gasping as the cold hit his lungs. Amos fell to his knees beside her, shouting her name until her eyes fluttered open. She coughed, weak but alive. "Get her to my lodge," Henry shouted over the wind. "She'll freeze out here." They half carried, half dragged her through the snow. By the time they reached the creek bend, their hands were numb and their faces raw. Henry got them inside, settled her near the fire, and pulled the hides tight again. Amos crouched beside his wife, breathing hard. She looked around the lodge, dazed but comforted by the steady heat. "It's warm," she whispered. Henry knelt opposite her. "You'll be fine now. Breathe slow." Amos looked up at him, and for the first time there was no pride left in his eyes, only exhaustion and something like shame. He stayed silent for a long time. Then, in a hoarse voice, he said, "I was wrong about you." Henry shook his head. "Don't matter. Just be glad she's safe." But Amos couldn't let it go. The words tumbled out, rough and halting. "All my talk, all them years of building, boasting, and it was you, with this little hut, who saved her. I don't understand how it works, but—" He looked around the lodge. "It feels alive in here, like the fire don't fight the cold. It just belongs." Henry poked the coals gently. "That's the secret. The lodge doesn't try to conquer the cold. It learns to live with it. Everything here breathes together. Fire, air, clay, hide. They all work the same way nature does. You build like this, and the land don't fight you back." Amos stared at the flickering light. His wife had already drifted into sleep, her breathing slow and even. "What are you gonna do when folks stop laughing and start copying?" Amos asked quietly. "They'll make you a teacher, maybe even a leader." Henry smiled faintly. "I don't aim to lead anyone. If they learn something, that's enough. I just don't want to see another winter bury what pride won't let men change." Amos looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "You've got a good heart, Claymore. I can't say I deserve your help." Henry added another stick to the fire. "Nobody deserves the cold, Amos. That's punishment enough." When dawn broke, the storm had passed. The world outside glittered in silence, the snow smooth and unbroken. Amos stepped out of the lodge and stared at the drifts. Chest high, heavy, dazzling under the pale sun. His cabin roof had collapsed entirely in the night. He stood there for a long while, then turned back to the round, unassuming dome behind him. It was small, almost invisible against the white hills, but it stood untouched. Smoke rose steady and thin. That day, Amos tore down what was left of his house, not out of defeat, but renewal. He asked Henry to show him how to build what the Lakota had taught him, and together they bent the first poles before noon. Neighbors came to watch. Some offered help. By the end of the week, they'd built 2 lodges side by side, one for Amos and his wife, another for an older widow downriver whose cabin had burned during the storm. Henry showed them how to line the seams with clay, how to vent the smoke with a cone of bark, how to build the fire low and steady. He didn't explain it like a craftsman explaining a trick. He spoke like a man passing down a prayer. By the time the snow melted that spring, there were 5 new lodges along the river. They looked strange against the horizon, small, round, earthy, but they worked. Families who'd once coughed through smoky nights slept warm and safe. And Henry Claymore's name, once a punchline, became something whispered with quiet respect. Yet Henry never took credit. When asked why he lived that way, he'd shrug and say, "Because it works." When someone thanked him for saving their home, he'd reply, "The land saved you, not me." He still spent his evenings alone by the river, tending his fire, watching the willows bend in the wind. Some nights, children would wander close to watch the smoke drift into the stars. He'd tell them stories then, not of battles or glory, but of the old ways, how the earth breathes warmth into the willing, how a fire's strength lies not in its size but in its steadiness, how the cold tests men not to break them, but to teach them patience. The children would sit wide-eyed until their mothers called them home, and Henry would smile to himself as their voices faded. He didn't know it then, but those stories, those quiet evenings by the fire, would outlast every cabin in that valley. Because when the next generation came to build, they didn't ask how to make something tall or fine. They asked how to make something that lasted. But the story of Henry Claymore didn't end with warmth and wisdom. For every man who learns, there's another who forgets. And as the years rolled on, progress returned like a storm on the horizon. Timber mills came, roads widened, and the valley that once bowed to the wind would soon stand against it again. And when that happened, the man who'd taught them all to live with the land would have to decide whether to stay or to vanish into it once more. The years passed, like pages turned by the wind. By the time a new decade began, the valley was no longer the same hollow of rough cabins and lonely fires it had been when Henry Claymore first arrived. Roads now cut clean lines through the sagebrush, and wagon ruts hardened into trade routes that wound between homesteads that were no longer temporary. Children who'd once played with sticks in the snow were now men, splitting boards and carving initials into beams. And in those years, Henry's lodge still stood, a round, humble dome by the river bend, its clay darkened and hardened by time, the smoke hole blackened from seasons of steady fire. It had become part of the landscape, as familiar as the cottonwoods beside it. He never built bigger, never sought to. He said once, when asked why he hadn't graduated to a proper cabin, that a man shouldn't outbuild his piece. "You start adding corners," he told Merrick one afternoon, "and you start inviting problems. Heat don't like corners and neither does quiet." It was the kind of saying that made men laugh the first time and think the second. By then, Henry wasn't the hermit of rumor anymore. He was an elder figure, the one neighbors went to when their wells froze or their roofs sagged. He'd help patch them up, never asking a thing in return. Some called him the old mountain preacher, though he'd never preached a word of scripture. He just lived it, steady, honest, and with a patience that wore through pride like water through stone. But progress is a restless thing. When the railroad surveyors came through, the valley's quiet rhythm began to change. They rode with steel rails in their eyes, measuring the land not by its silence, but by its potential. They saw the river bend not as a place of peace, but as a crossing. The same earth that Henry had used for clay, they saw as a bed for iron. One of them, a sharp young man in a grey coat, rode out to meet Henry that summer. His name was Calvin Royston, assistant engineer for the Northern Spur Company. He found Henry sitting by the river, mending a fish trap. "Mr. Claymore?" he asked. "I hear you're the man who's been living out here longer than anyone." Henry looked up with the same calm patience that had unnerved so many hot-headed men before him. "Long enough," he said. Royston dismounted and unrolled a set of maps. "We're planning to run a spur through this valley, a line that'll connect with the main rail to the west. There's a good grade here, gentle enough for the bend. We'll have to clear some land, about 20 acres north of the creek." Henry squinted at the map. "That'd take you right through my lodge?" The young man nodded, almost apologetic. "I'm afraid so. But the company's offering compensation, generous, considering it's what it is, Henry said softly, is my home." Royston cleared his throat. Yes, sir, but progress comes to all of us eventually. The town's growing. You could move closer in, build yourself something proper with lumber. Wouldn't take but a week. I'm sure the company'd even help. Henry stood, wiping his hands. You ever spend a winter out here, Mr. Royston? The engineer hesitated. Can't say I have. Henry smiled faintly. Then you don't know how much that little dome means when the snow starts to howl. But I suppose men in offices don't think much about how wind moves or where heat hides. You'll do what you came to do. Just try not to break what you don't understand. Royston frowned. We're not here to break anything, Mr. Claymore. We're here to build. Henry looked back at the river, the same river he'd drawn water from for nearly 2 decades. Every man who's ever said that, he murmured, has ended up doing both. When the surveyors left, Henry knew the valley's quiet years were ending. Within months, crews arrived, men with saws, shovels, and dynamite. They cut the cottonwoods that lined the bend, stacked them in neat rows for ties, and cleared a path straight through the willows. At first, the neighbors were excited. The railroad meant trade, growth, money. They'd been waiting years for it. But as the cutting went on, as the hum of saws and the crack of trees replaced the old hush of wind, some began to feel uneasy. Feels wrong, said Merrick, now grey-bearded and slower in his step. This valley used to breathe. Henry didn't reply. He just kept tending his lodge, knowing each day brought it closer to its end. When the first line of track reached the creek, a foreman rode up with a company letter in hand. Mr. Claymore, he said, we'll need to start grading here by next week. I've got orders to clear the area. Henry looked up from his work, his hands still steady. And if I don't move, the foreman sighed, then the men will do it for you. You'll be paid fair. I don't want trouble. Henry looked past him, toward the thin black line of rail stretching across the hills, a scar of progress glittering in the sun. You won't get trouble, he said, but you won't get understanding either. The foreman shifted uneasily. I'll give you a week, then the line moves forward. That night, Henry sat by his fire long after the stars rose. The air was still, the kind of stillness that only comes before change. He thought of the years he'd spent here, the storms that had come and gone, the families that had learned, the men who'd once laughed and later thanked him. He thought of Samuel Price's boy, now grown, who'd built his own home in the same way and raised a family that never knew the cold as their fathers had. He thought of Amos Laird, who'd died 3 winters ago, buried beside the very lodge Henry had helped him build. His widow still lived there, her sons having repaired the clay each spring like tending a sacred duty. And he thought of the land itself, the earth that had given him warmth, the fire that had never once failed him. He slept lightly that night as though his bones already knew they'd be moving soon. The morning of the clearing, men came with axes and chains. Henry met them outside, his rifle slung across his shoulder, not in threat but in habit. The foreman, true to his word, handed him a folded note with payment. Henry didn't take it. Keep your money, he said quietly. If I'm leaving, I'll leave on my own. Mr. Claymore, the foreman said, we can't delay. The line. Henry raised a hand. I understand. He turned, stepped inside the lodge, and for a moment stood still, his eyes sweeping across the space that had been more than shelter. It had been a companion. The walls were lined with smoke-darkened hides, the floor layered with furs polished smooth from years of use. The same small stones circled the fire pit, each one blackened but unbroken. He knelt and touched them, one by one, as though saying goodbye. Then carefully he took a single coal from the fire, glowing faint and red, and placed it inside a small tin box. When he stepped outside, the men had already started cutting the nearest trees. Don't bother with the lodge, he told them. It'll come down when it's ready. He turned toward the hills and began walking east, the box in his pocket warm against his side. The valley watched him go. For a while, people said he'd moved upriver, maybe to the foothills near the Bighorns. Others said he'd gone north to live among the Lakota again. Merrick swore he saw smoke rising one morning from a distant ridge, thin and steady, the kind that spoke of Henry's careful fires. The railroad came and went. Trains whistled through the valley, carrying lumber, coal, and strangers who never knew the quiet that had once ruled here. The land changed, roads widened, the river was bridged, but the memory of the man by the creek bend didn't fade. Every winter, when the snow came hard and the wind screamed through the valley, families would seal their chimneys tighter, check the clay seams on their walls, and build their fires small but steady. And when someone would ask where those strange little lodges came from, those round huts that still dotted the river's edge, warm and silent, the old-timers would tell them the story, not with grandeur or embellishment, but with the kind of respect you only give to a truth that's been tested by time. They'd say, there was a man once who built a home like the ones the Indians made. Folks called it primitive, till they froze half to death while he slept warm on half their firewood. And they'd nod toward the hills and add, he's gone now, but if you ever find yourself in a storm, build the way he did. Lo, tight and humble. The cold don't hate a man who listens. Years later, Samuel Price's son, now a grown man with lines around his eyes and a cabin of his own, found something while digging near the old creek bend, a patch of hardened clay, and beneath it a ring of stones. Inside that ring, buried beneath soot and soil, was a small tin box. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single blackened coal, long dead, and a folded scrap of parchment. On it, written in faded ink, were just a few words. Heat belongs to the humble. The son stood there a long while, the wind moving slow through the reeds. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so he did neither. He just reburied the tin, replaced the earth, and went home to tend his fire. Smaller than usual that night, but warmer somehow. And though Henry Claymore's name never made it into any history book, his lessons did, passed from word of mouth to practice, from father to son, from lodge to cabin. In that quiet valley, long after the trains had gone and the noise of progress had faded into memory, the winters were still met with the same wisdom that had once seemed like heresy. Don't fight the cold, understand it, build small, breathe with the land, and keep your fire steady. But as the world moved on, as the frontier gave way to cities and the iron road grew rusted and forgotten, one last winter would return to that valley, a storm so fierce it buried the tracks themselves and reminded the people once again why a man named Henry Claymore had built as he did. Because some lessons can't be learned from books or progress. They have to be felt in the bones when the fire's low and the wind's outside, whispering the old truths back into the dark. And that winter, those who remembered him, those who still built low and humble, would be the only ones whose fires never went out. The blizzard came down from the north in the winter of '94, 20 years to the month since Henry Claymore had first raised that small round lodge by the river. The old folks said they'd never seen one like it, not even in their father's time. It came in without warning, a wall of white rolling over the mountains like a tide, swallowing the sun, the fences, the very sound of the earth. For 3 days, the sky was a living thing, thick, grey and heavy. It pressed against the roofs and rattled the shutters, moaned through every gap and seam. The valley, once proud of its progress, found itself trembling before the same old enemy the pioneers had feared, the cold. By the second night, chimneys were clogged with ice, windows cracked under frost, and barns stood buried to their eaves. Men burned furniture to keep their families alive. The railroad shut down. Its iron tracks vanished under 15 feet of drift. The modern cabins, tall, proud, and square, turned into ice boxes, and through it all, a few small domes stood like buried stones in the white. From the ridges above, they looked like the backs of sleeping beasts, half swallowed by snow. But inside them, fires still breathed. Inside, the warmth was low, steady, unhurried, the kind of warmth that didn't roar, but lingered, the kind Henry Claymore had always preached. Don't fight the cold, learn its rhythm. Samuel Price's son, now a man in his 40s with grey in his beard, huddled with his family inside their earth lodge that winter. The wind outside screamed so loud that words had to be shouted, yet inside, the air was still. He'd built his home from the same pattern Henry had taught his father, bent willow ribs, thick clay seams, smoke vent at the top. His youngest, a boy of 10, looked toward the fire pit. "Pa," he said, voice small, "you think the other houses'll be all right?" Samuel's son looked into the flames, the coals glowing deep red like sleeping hearts. "Depends how they built 'em," he said softly. "The wind don't care about wood or nails, but if a man listens, the land keeps him safe." The boy frowned, trying to understand. "Who told you that?" He smiled faintly. "An old friend of your grandpa's. Fella who lived by the creek. Name was Henry Claymore." The boy blinked. "The one from the stories? The one who burned half the firewood everyone else did?" "That's him." The boy grinned. "Was he really half Indian?" His father shook his head. "No, just half wise, before the rest of us caught up." They both laughed quietly, and the wind's howl outside seemed softer for it. Across the valley, others weren't so lucky. The modern cabins, the ones built tall and proud with glass windows and square rooms, began to fail by the third night. One family's roof cracked under the weight of snow. Another's stovepipe burst, filling the house with smoke. In one place, the fire went out completely, the logs frozen before they could catch. That was when they started remembering the old stories. By the morning of the fourth day, figures began to appear through the storm. Neighbors trudging through waist-deep drifts, faces red and raw, carrying children wrapped in quilts. One by one they came to the small lodges along the river bend, the same ones their grandfathers had once mocked. They knocked, begged shelter, and were taken in. Inside those domes, strangers and kin crowded together in the soft glow of steady fires. The air smelled of smoke, fur, and humanity, the ancient scent of survival. No one spoke much. They just listened to the wind tearing at the world outside and thanked whatever power had guided those who'd built small and humble. On the fifth day, when the blizzard's voice finally began to fade, the valley lay silent beneath mountains of snow. The sun returned weakly, like an ember through the clouds. The first men to step outside saw devastation. Barns caved in, wagons buried, fences erased. But they also saw something else. The lodges. They stood untouched. The snow had rolled over them, not broken them. The wind had slid past their curves instead of ripping at corners. The fires inside had melted the walls just enough to seal them tighter, like the lodges had been alive and defending themselves. One of the younger men, a farmer named Caleb Harper, climbed onto his roof and looked out over the valley. His cabin had nearly frozen through, but his father-in-law's small earthen dome down by the river still smoked. He shook his head in disbelief. "That old man," he muttered. "He was right all along." When the snow finally thawed weeks later, the valley held a meeting in the town's schoolhouse, one of the few buildings still intact. They gathered by lantern light, wrapped in blankets. Men with frostbitten hands sat beside those who'd come through unscathed. The talk turned from loss to rebuilding. "We can't keep building the same way," said Merrick's grandson, now the town's blacksmith. "These new-style houses, they're all corners and draught. You might as well be heating the prairie. My forge went cold 3 times this storm. But my uncle's lodge, he barely used a quarter cord all week," the room murmured. Some nodded. Others frowned. Caleb Harper spoke next. "We've spent years mocking what worked. Henry Claymore tried to tell our fathers. Maybe it's time we finally listened," someone at the back asked. "But who knows how to build 'em right anymore?" Samuel's son stood up slowly. "I do," he said. "My father learned from Henry himself." The room fell quiet. "Then, teach us," someone said. Through the spring and into the summer, the valley buzzed with work. But this time, there was no boasting, no arguments about lumber or fancy roofs. Men bent willow poles again, plastered clay into their seams, and packed snow-mud mixtures tight as mortar. Women stitched hides into coverings, laughing when the children smeared their faces with clay. It became more than rebuilding. It was remembering. Each man who'd once prided himself on progress now spoke of breathing walls and earth warmth. They rediscovered the wisdom Henry had left them, the understanding that shelter wasn't about strength, but balance. And though no one said it outright, every time a man bent that first willow into an arc, he thought of the figure who'd once stood in the same snow, humming to himself while building something the world called primitive. One evening, after a long day of work, Samuel's son walked to the old river bend. The tracks from the railroad were still there, though rusted and half swallowed by grass. The land was quiet again. He followed the bank until he found the spot where, years ago, he'd unearthed the tin box. The earth had settled flat since then. Kneeling, he brushed away the grass and found the faint outline of hardened clay, all that was left of Henry's lodge. He placed his hand on it. The earth beneath was warm from the day's sun, but he fancied he could still feel something deeper, a trace of the old fire. He whispered, "We remembered, Henry." The wind stirred the reeds in answer, soft and low. Then, as he stood to leave, he thought he saw a flicker of smoke far off in the eastern hills, faint, steady, too thin to be a brush fire. For a moment he smiled. The story of that valley spread far and quiet. Years later, travelers would pass through and marvel at the small, round lodges scattered among the newer homes, earthen domes that looked ancient yet somehow enduring. When they asked about them, locals would just shrug and say, "They're from the old ways. A man named Claymore started it." Some would scoff, others would listen. But every winter, when the cold returned, even the skeptics built their fires smaller, sealed their cracks tighter, and whispered a small thanks to the nameless wisdom of a man they'd never met. By the turn of the century, Henry Claymore was legend. Some said he'd died in the mountains. Others claimed he'd gone back to the Lakota, teaching them how settlers' tools could blend with their ways. A few swore that on clear mornings after the snow, they'd seen a thin column of smoke rising from the ridges to the east, always the same place, always the same shape. It became a superstition among the valley folk. If you saw Claymore's smoke before winter, your fire would last the season. Children grew up telling his story in schools, not as a myth, but as a parable. They called him the man who listened to the cold. Decades later, long after the last train ran through the valley, an old woman, the widow of Caleb Harper, sat beside her granddaughter's hearth. The child was restless, asking endless questions as children do. "Grandma," she said, "how come our house is round, not square like the ones in town?" The old woman smiled. "Because this kind of house knows how to keep a secret." "What secret?" "That warmth belongs to the humble." The girl tilted her head. "Who told you that?" "A man named Henry," she said softly, "long before I was born." The fire crackled, and for a moment the wind outside seemed to pause, as if listening. Years turned, and the story faded again, not forgotten but folded into the land itself. The railroad rusted, the lodges crumbled, and the valley turned wild once more. But even then, in the ruins, travelers sometimes found strange traces, rings of blackened stones, hardened clay shaped by hands long gone. And if they built a small fire there, low and steady, the wind would always die down. The smoke would rise clean, the heat would linger, calm and even, as though the earth itself remembered. They say that somewhere, far in the northern mountains, an old man was once seen tending a small fire beside a half-buried hut. His hair was white, his coat patched with hides, his hands blackened with soot. When a passing trapper asked him how he kept warm without a roaring fire, the old man just smiled and said, "Because I know where warmth lives." The trapper blinked, and when he looked again, the man was gone, only the faint glow of coals left in the snow. He told that story for years, though most never believed it. But those who did, those who'd heard of Henry Claymore and his lodge, just nodded and said, maybe he never left at all. So the valley slept again, cradled between its hills, warmed not by progress or invention, but by a truth older than any man, that to live with the land is to live wisely, and that a humble fire, well tended, unhurried and patient, can outlast empires. And somewhere when the wind rises over the plains and the snow begins to fall, if you listen close enough, you might still hear him, the faint rasp of a man humming by his fire, content with little, alive with everything.